ladies and gentlemen, what you just saw was home movie footage, some of it shot by my mom, who wasn't the best photographer in the world, some of it by me, because I was very keen to get a hold of that Bell and Howell movie projector, a movie camera. That was at St. Paul's Anglican Residential School on the Blood Reserve, Kainai First Nation, between the years of late 1952 and 1963. The school, St. Paul's, had been under the principalship of Canon Middleton, who was a British fellow, and he had very British ideas about what a boarding school should be like. He believed that there should be a cadet corps and all the things that you associate with British boarding schools. But he did try to learn the Blackfoot language. He tried to deliver sermons in the Blackfoot language. And he was the principal of the school for decades, simply decades. So by the time my family arrived with my dad, an Anglican minister from Nova Scotia, the Anglican parishioners on the Blood Reserve were pretty well familiar with the school and how it ran, and they welcomed my family, my parents. My father was given a Blackfoot name, a red man coming up the hill, which means a holy man who comes from far away. I was given the name of Little Yellow Hair by the Blackfoot. And this was a precursor, a sign of things to come, because my parents formed friendships with the Kainai people. And they maintained those friendships even after my dad took a new principalship in the town of Latuk, Quebec. We have film footage about that too. And the Blackfoot parishioners, many of them kept in touch with my parents for years afterwards. So that's a personal story. Just continuing the personal story just a little bit. I attended classes at St. Paul's with the Kainai kids between the ages of 6 and when did I start going into junior high? 13. Anyhow, after I'd completed grade 6 with the Kainai kids, I then got on the bus with them, and we went into town to this white public school in the town of Cardston, and that's where I got my secondary education. Sadly, my Kainai classmates did not do so well. When I graduated in 1964, there was, I think, one Kainai graduate in the class, Beverly. And I think Beverly stuck with it because she had a very good white friend who perhaps gave her some help and encouragement. So yeah, they didn't do well in the public school in Cardston. And that may explain why many of the graduation rates among Indigenous people are not so great if they're attending white public schools. However, there are now more Indigenous-run schools, and the Blood Reserve now has a very active one, which I'm very pleased to see. I'm still in touch with some of the parishioners of the St. Paul's Anglican Church there, some of them former residential school students or children of those students. We are on good terms. We keep in touch via Facebook. And the Dewolf family, there were 7 of us children. The Dewolf family helps out the parish in certain ways at certain times when that's possible. So we keep in touch, and we have fondness for the Kainai, and my father had a fondness for them. He certainly did. And having taken sociology in Trinity College, University of Toronto as a young man, he was very aware of cultures, how cultures were important, and how you had to pay attention to people's cultures. And the way you treated them had a lot to do with their cultures. And so for that reason, and perhaps just because he was a kind and thoughtful and yeah, a thoughtful person. He promoted the Blackfoot culture. The school magazine, Aganixin, Sokapi Aganixin, sorry, means good news, and it contained stories written by the children that were their tribal lore, and their artwork was featured, and my father made it very clear that he was very keen to support and promote the Blackfoot culture that the children and their parents valued. So when I graduated from Cardston High School, I took off for Nova Scotia and I went to the University of King's College in Halifax, my father's alma mater. And then I went on from that to take education at Dalhousie, and I became an English teacher. And I was taught English for more than 30 years, either in Canada, in Nova Scotia, or in the Republic of Singapore. And I was very fortunate to grow up where I did on the Blood Reserve, because it made me aware of cultural differences. It better prepared me for being in the midst of a very different culture when I went to Singapore. And it opened my eyes to many things. And it's the eye-opening, I guess, that we're talking about today. We rely on academics to provide us with information, reliable information, that helps us understand our history, to know our history, to understand it, put it in proper context, and so on. And if Rod had started today's session by giving his presentation, and then I would have come on later, the first thing I was going to say in my presentation was the story of the residential schools is complicated. And it's the lack of complexity in the summary of the TRC that Rod and I took particular issue with when we started our book. We both waded through the actual report, a job made not easy at all by the fact that it had no index, despite the many workers they had working for the commission and the money that was spent. I was a fan of the commission when it was first established. I thought I had great hopes for it. But then the commissioners who had been appointed all decided they didn't want to be commissioners anymore. And the reasons they gave were kind of waffly, but I think from what I have read, they sensed that there was going to be confrontation with Indigenous people. And so new commissioners were appointed, and Murray Sinclair, of course, is the most well-known one. Even so, I tried to support the commission as best I could. I was interviewed twice, I think, by researchers from the TRC, and they seemed to be very fair, very intelligent people. One of them, mind you, showed great surprise when I told her that St. Paul's didn't have a fence around it to keep the kids in. And that might indicate a certain amount of prejudice, prejudging. But they were good researchers, I think. One of them left the TRC halfway through its mandate. And the excuse she gave me at the time was that a friend of hers had started a company and she wanted to go work with her friend. But I have my suspicions, of course, that her views perhaps conflicted with the views of the commissioners. That just a suspicion. I also attended 2 national gatherings of the TRC. One of the very first ones, if not the first one, was in Halifax. And in Halifax, I delivered to the public, the assembly, a little fable of my own about a taxi cab loaded with passengers that, because of carelessness, thoughtlessness, plows into an innocent homeowner who's out on his front lawn and knocks him to the ground. This was, of course, meant to be a metaphor for colonialism, the arrival of a new civilization, a new culture. and the damage it did to indigenous people. But the passengers jumped out of my taxi cab, and one of them rushed to the aid of the downed homeowner and tried to do what she could. She didn't know what was best to help him, but she did what she could. And that, of course, was my metaphor for people like my parents and the people they worked with. There was a lawyer in the taxi cab, and of course the lawyer was worried about legal problems and so on that might result from this accident, and so on. And my little fable was well received by all three commissioners and also by the Bishop of Nova Scotia, who came up to me afterwards and thanked me. The assembly, the assembled multitude, most of whom were Indigenous Nova Scotians, were respectful and very polite to me, and there was no problem whatsoever. And this encouraged me to attend another national gathering, this one in Edmonton, and it was one of the last, if not the last, national gatherings. I flew out to Edmonton, and while I didn't speak to the entire assembly there, I did speak at a sharing circle, and I shared my story just as I'm sharing it with you now. And again, I was met with respect, politeness, a willingness to listen, and I came away thinking, yes, the TRC might be doing a very good job. And then the report came out, and it is difficult to wade through. It's full of information, much of it negative, but also a good deal of it positive. But no, there's no index, so you can't look up certain things. Trying to find my name in it might be a little difficult, but I'm in it. It's the summary. I believe the summary begins with a sentence that says, although there may have been positive aspects to the TRC, to the residential schools, and then the rest of the summary goes on. That's the only mention of positive things in the summary. And it's a summary, really, that Rod and I focused on when we wrote our book, From Truth Comes Reconciliation. Since then, I've tried to keep in touch with the Kainai. I've continued doing research, digging up documents. It's documents, actual Indian affairs reports with data and figures and so on that we should be relying upon and which more people should be relying upon. But I'm afraid I don't see much of that. I see lots of claims, 150,000 Indigenous children were taken from their homes and forced into residential schools. Well, no, that claim has been made over and over again. But if you look at the data again and again, you see, no, that doesn't hold up. First of all, it wasn't until 1920, which was about, 37 years after the residential schools were established. John A. Macdonald, is he a bad guy? We should tear down his statue. John A. thought that taking kids away from their homes might be hard on the kids, so he didn't make attendance at a residential school compulsory. He didn't do it. And he deliberately didn't make it compulsory to attend a residential school, even though some of his Ontario Indigenous friends were very in favor of such schools because they themselves had attended one. No, he left it up to the parents. And it wasn't until 1920, with a completely different prime minister, that there was an amendment to the Indian Act that said that going to school was compulsory. That's it, going to school. Didn't say residential school, it just said going to school. And the province of Ontario had, I think, 30 or 40 years earlier, had made school attendance compulsory. But finally, in 1920, the Indian Act was amended, and you had to attend school. And some kids went to residential schools after that, and a lot of kids, many more, went to day schools, and a few were perhaps lucky enough to get to public, or unlucky enough to go to public schools, white public schools. one of the things that's never mentioned by the critics of the the residential schools is the penalty. Anyone in the room know the penalty for not sending your kid to school? No. The penalty was $2. All right. Which at the time, I looked it up, was about the cost of 2 dozen eggs. Or it could be a term of imprisonment of 2 weeks. I think it was 2 weeks imprisonment if you didn't send your kid to a school. The Indian Act specified, this amendment specified that, if I have it here, yes, I do. No parent would be penalized if their child was unable to attend school by reason of sickness or other unavoidable cause, or has been excused in writing by the Indian agent or teacher for temporary absence to assist in husbandry or urgent and necessary household duties. The penalty for failing to enroll a child in some kind of school was not more than $2 in costs or imprisonment for a period not exceeding 10 days or both. And I say $2 was the cost of 2 dozen eggs. The Indian Act of 1920 amendment also stated the chief and the council of any band that has children in a school shall have the right to inspect such school at reasonable times as may be agreed upon by the Indian agent and the principal of the school. Now, this to me does not sound like a genocidal attempt to tear children from their families. It does speak to me, however, of the failure of responsible Indian leaders, activists, the TRC in its summary, the failure to show to Canadians the complexity of a system that was in many ways harmful, many ways not well administered or carried out. We must remember that a good part of the Indian school history was during the Great Depression, and money was short. The spending of money was always, of course, very much in the thoughts of the Indian Affairs people. Anything they could do to cut costs, but I certainly didn't see that at St. Paul's. One thing about the school, St. Paul's had, this is a good story, so I have to share it. The school had a pretty good hockey team. And it occasionally played against other teams in the area in southern Alberta, but they didn't have uniforms. They didn't have hockey uniforms. And my father thought this was a terrible shame, and so did, I think, the players. And so my father went out and he bought uniforms for the kids. And he made the mistake of taking the money for those uniforms out of a particular budget in the school, which he was not supposed to do. And the Indian Affairs Department was not very happy about that. They didn't cut him any slack. They demanded that he recompense the school for the money that was spent. My father didn't have an awful lot of money himself, and principals were not greatly paid, highly paid. And so he relied upon his family back in Bedford, Nova Scotia. And his family in Bedford, Nova Scotia, a family that also produced Admiral Harry Dewolf, of whom you may have heard. He was my dad's cousin. The Bedford Dewolf sent money to my dad, and my dad was able to make it okay with the Department of Indian Affairs. Now, that's the kind of complexity in the history of the residential schools that is completely missing. And the fact that it's not brought out in any form tells me that it's history. History is not really what's wanted there. It's more of a narrative, a story, even propaganda, one might say. And it makes me distrust of so many statements made by Indigenous leaders and their supporters. And trust is important. I wish I had more trust in the commissioners of the TRC and the people who have used the TRC's report to support their views, their claims. However, that's my story. I went off to university after graduating from Cardston High School, and I didn't spend a lot of time at the Latuk school, but during summer vacations I visited the school, and what I saw in the Latuk school, which served Northern Cree kids from such places as Mistassini Post, which is really in the far north, they had to come out by float plane and then by bus. The footage that you saw earlier on, the other half of the footage is about life at the Latuk school. And a good deal of it is about the Latuk kids who were very good at hockey and who got to go twice to Europe to play hockey against European hockey teams. And that was under the next principal. After my father left, the next principal was from Switzerland, and he thought it was a good idea to take the Cree kids to Switzerland and give them a chance to play hockey there. The joy, the happiness on the faces of the kids who went to Europe to play hockey tells you a lot about what was like at the Latuk school too, under Father Bernard. In any case, that's all I have to say, but I'm certainly willing to take questions, and I'm sure you've got some really pertinent and very helpful ones in store for me. So I'll turn it over to you, and please fire any question you like at me. I'd be pleased to hear them.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Do I hear applause? Thank you.
Okay, Mark, maybe I'll start off the question period. I was wondering, I've heard a lot about something called the Sixties Scoop, but I don't know much about it. Could you maybe explain a little bit about what is meant by the Sixties Scoop?
Well, first, a little background. In the early days of the Indian residential schools, of course, those were the days when there were not children's aid societies. And as the years went by, Canada started to develop children's aid societies, mostly in the 1940s to 1960s, when the children's aid societies, welfare organizations really got going in Canada. That idea that children should be helped and sheltered and given support spread to the residential schools. And the residential schools increasingly took in kids who were in some kind of risk in their homes, who could really use some kind of day-to-day support, because there weren't any children aid societies for Indigenous kids. At the same time, of course, there was a growing feeling that the Children's Aid Society available to other Canadians should be available to Indigenous kids too. And that's when people went into Indigenous homes and took the children away. And they did. They took the children away because it was their view that the children were in danger, that the children were in a dysfunctional situation. Their parents were single parents. There was a great deal of alcohol or possibly drugs. And for the very same reasons that Children's Aid Society step in today. And so the 60 Scoop was created. That name, of course, has been, like other English terms, has been used to make it sound dreadful. And for some kids, it might have been very dreadful to be removed from their homes, from their parent or parents. So it was not perfect either. I would say it was probably very complex. And I'm not sure a really good study has been made of it, but it's a great example of how the English language has been, with words like survivor and genocide, have been used to demonize the residential school story. And the 60s Scoop, to me, is the same kind of misuse of language. It wasn't just a mindless, heartless scoop of kids by heartless, mindless children's aid people. These were caring people very similar to my parents, but they thought they knew best, like our taxi driver, taxi passengers. And that's that's what I have on the 60 Scoop. I've never done an in-depth study of it, so I can't tell you much more than that.
Okay, I was, do you want to go ahead, please?
I'm doing just that little thing. Okay? Yes. Okay. I have a question, because obviously you've spent a great deal of time studying this, whether part of the problem with the examination, as you say, of the complexity of the residential schools is the lack of perspective. Nowadays, the way we deal with children is so very different from how everybody dealt with children in the past, and that what you would have called normal schools in the regular communities would be quite different from what we would expect now. My mother arrived at her first day of grade 1 and speaking no English at all, and was tossed into a classroom, and it was basically sink or swim, and there was nobody who, basically she caught on because she had to. And physical punishment, you know, the strap was popular, and roughing the principal was very willing to rough up boys who got out of line. And what I'm wondering is has something been terribly lost? Because there may be very true stories from the residential schools that if you really worked hard, you could probably find equal or better stories from the regular schools. Is it the perspective that we've lost?
Yes, I agree. Perspective, context. Just recently, a band that a musical group that I played in for something like 50 years broke up. But the lead guitarist in my band went to St. Patrick's Roman Catholic High School in Halifax in the 1960s. And the strap was still being used when he went to high school in the 1960s. And if you try to point this out and say, well, this is part of the perspective, we have to realize that a lot of what went on in residential schools went on in white public schools as well. It was just what was done at the time. And if you say that, it's just brushed aside. All right, that may have been true, but it still did great harm to Indigenous people and should never have happened. It was harm inflicted. And that's the reply I've received when I try to point out that lots of kids received the strap right up until the 1960s, when gradually it was removed as a punishment. Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent question. And yes, I wish more people could look at the perspective and see things in context and see some of the complexity.
Hello, Mark. Nice to see you. Good, thank you. I believe this is the book, right, where it's an edited volume, is that correct? The book? The book is it's your edited collection.
Well, it is an edited collection of stories, testimonies, accounts, and so on, by a number of Canadians who either worked in the schools or had connections with it. But it also contains a few chapters by Rod and me.
Okay. Anyway, I wanted to ask you a question about, you mentioned the students, the Aboriginal students who went to the public school in Cardston, and that they didn't do very well in that school, and that there as well is now Indigenous-run schools in that community. First of all, I just was wondering what your thoughts were on why they didn't do very well when they went to the school in Cardston, and as well, it's my understanding that the schools in Aboriginal communities have a very low standard of education as well. So although there might be children that are staying in school in the Aboriginal-run schools, that the standard is very, very low comparatively to what they would have received in the residential schools. And it's my understanding as well that parents often would send their children to residential schools because the standard at those schools was higher than what they would receive at the day school. Do you have any thoughts on that?
In some schools, that certainly would have been true. Some residential schools had excellent teachers of a very high quality. In St. Paul's, we had a grade 6 teacher named Mr. McGilp, who came from England He was a very good teacher, I can tell you. He was strict in a reasonable way, but not harsh in any way. And he knew his stuff, and he really prepared me for grade 7 in the secondary school in Cardston. I think the other kids who were my classmates, a lot of whom had spent their class time drawing pictures of horses, however, went in on the bus with me into Cardston, and there they found a junior high and then later a high school staffed by Mormon teachers who had their own particular way of educating, but it was in a way it was very good because, of course, very clean living. There wasn't a lot of smoking and drinking out behind the school, I'll tell you. So they were protected from that sort of secondary school temptation. But these were teachers who had not been trained or prepared in any way to teach Indigenous kids. And I don't think they were very sensitive to the Blackfoot needs, the culture, the fact that a certain amount of leeway would probably have to be allowed for. They'd probably just plowed ahead, teaching as they had for a good number of years to good Mormon kids who went home and worked hard and did their homework. And the teachers were not receptive enough and sensitive enough, I think, to the Indigenous kids. And one by one, they would have dropped out. My best friend in high school, in that secondary school, Cardston Consolidated High School, was a fellow named Doug Cuthand. I don't know, some of you may have heard of Doug Cuthand. He was producing films for a while there, and he has written columns on Indigenous issues. He lives in Saskatchewan, which is where he and his family came from. His father, the Reverend Stan Cuthand, was the Anglican minister in Cardston. And Doug and I became very good friends. And Doug became a Canadian teenager, I can tell you. He liked pop music. He liked driving cars. We had a lot of fun with cars and so on. And as far as I knew, Doug was the perfect Canadian teenager. But years later, and when I got in touch with Doug, he said no. He encountered racism in the Canadian school, in the high school. Despite the fact that he had a non-Indigenous girlfriend, he believed that he had been treated differently because of his race. And for that reason, he was not happy about his high school career. He did reasonably well, I believe. I'll mention, since you asked about the quality of teaching in the residential school, it certainly prepared me very well for the public school in Cardston, because in grade 9, 3 years after I came to the junior high first and then through the high school. So 6 years, I guess, after I joined the secondary system there, and I'm not bragging here, really, honestly, I'm not. I got the Governor General's Medal for the best grades in grade 9 that year. So the residential school education didn't do me any harm, I must say. I was very pleased with the teaching I got. And of course, the teachers were, in many cases, were friends with my parents. But they were good teachers, and my father kept an eye on them. On one occasion, a student, one of the St. Paul students, came home from a summer camp that the school ran in Waterton National Park, which was not very far from us. A student came home from that camp and reported to my father that one of the staff members had made an inappropriate advance. And my father immediately fired that teacher. That teacher was gone as soon as the student reported this. Now that tells you not that my father was a really harsh administrator or whatever. It tells you something about the trust that the kid had in my father. The kid would not have told that story if he didn't think my father was going to do something about it. So to me, that's an important story.
So in terms of your comments about the school in Cardston not really being sensitive to Aboriginal culture, what needs to be, what would have needed to be done in order to ensure that the Aboriginal students would be able to continue on to graduation in that school, do you think?
Well, if I'd been the principal of the Cardston High School, I probably would have invited Indigenous leaders, some of the tribal leaders, to come into the school and give talks. I would have encouraged the art teacher to encourage the students to create traditional art, things of that sort. An exploration of tribal stories. Some people would have called them folk tales, I suppose, but it would have shown that there was a sensitivity and an understanding of how important these could be to the Indigenous kids. The day-to-day treatment of the kids, however, was perhaps more important, more significant than any curriculum change or special efforts, because I have a pretty good idea that those teachers, those good Mormon teachers, some of whom came from the United States, one of them from Kentucky, looked at Indigenous kids, and just looking at them funny would have sent a message, I'm afraid. And it didn't encourage the kids to stay on. Only one, Beverly, got to grade 12 with me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll just have one final question, if I might. Yeah, we're almost out of time here. But I was just wondering, I've heard a lot about Indigenous children being forbidden from speaking their language at the residential schools. Could you tell us more about that?
Yes, certainly in some schools that was the case. In the Shubenacadie School here in Nova Scotia, a school that was largely created because of those welfare issues, incidentally. A great number of the students that the Shubenacadie School took in were children who were in danger at home. They were being neglected. They were having real trouble in the schools that they were already attending. They were welfare cases. But in that school, the leadership of the school was very strict about speaking the Mi'kmaq language. And many of the former students have recounted stories of how they were punished just for speaking Mi'kmaq. And that's not surprising from what I've seen of that particular principal. Yeah, he was a pretty strict guy. Some would even say harsh. And perhaps not what you want for a school for kids who are already having trouble. But getting back to the original question, this varied from school to school. Some schools are very strict about it, like the Shubenacadie School. Other schools are far more lenient. Canon Middleton, who preceded my father at St. Paul's, he permitted Blackfoot to be spoken after 6 o'clock at night. So the kids could go back to the dormitories and talk their native language to their heart's content. It was only during the day when the kids were in class, when they were around their teachers and their supervisors who had to know what they were saying, they had to speak English. And I'm sure that there were punishments for not obeying that rule. But as I've said, Middleton tried to learn the Blackfoot language himself. My father's time, the kids could speak Blackfoot anytime at all, except in class. In class, they had to speak English. And again, it was because the teacher needed to know what they were saying as they spoke to each other and to them. And also, it was, of course, it was immersion. It was an immersion class, really. It was an immersion in English, and you were expected to speak the language of the class. And that was accepted, certainly by the time we arrived in 1952, December of 1952. My father's rule, speak English in class. Out of class, yeah. You want to know why I don't speak Blackfoot? Because my classmates didn't speak English outside of class. They spoke Blackfoot. And I only learned a few words. One of them is nuwa. Nuwa means look out. And that was usually said when there was a supervisor approaching or something to look out for. Yeah, nuwa. But I also learned Oki, which is hello, and a few other Blackfoot words, but no more than that, because I didn't get into immersion with the kids. They were all speaking their language in the rec room and in the dining hall and out on the playing fields and so on. It was all Blackfoot. And I didn't get a chance to learn Cree when my father moved to the town of Latuk. There too, I believe it was the same rule. You can speak your native language as much as you like, as long as you're not in class with your teacher who doesn't speak the language. Yeah, good question.
Okay, well, Mark, thank you very much. We're very grateful for you joining us today. Please join me in giving a round of applause for Mark.